The next item of business today is the members' business debate on motion number 8742 in the name of Stuart-McMillan on society's increasing reliance on food banks. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, and I'd be grateful if those members who wish to speak in the debate could please press the request to speak buttons as soon as possible. I call on Stuart-McMillan to open the debate. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. First of all, I'd like to thank all the members who supported the motion, but particularly those members from the opposition benches who have actually supported it to allow this to take place. This gives this Parliament the opportunity to discuss what really is a worrying issue in Scotland and indeed across the whole of the UK. I would much prefer not to be discussing the issue today, but we need to. And I want to thank the Trussell Trust, Barnardo's, Oxfam, Nourish Scotland and the Citizens Advice Scotland for providing their briefings prior to this debate. I would also like to welcome representatives from the Trussell Trust who are in the public gallery today. The commitment and dedication of the volunteers at the Trussell Trust and other emergency food providers is to be wholeheartedly commended. And I also want to thank everyone across Scotland who volunteer their time in their communities, providing support for those in need, whether it's in food banks or other community activities. It's important to put on the record the work of a food bank. In essence, actually, what is a food bank? A food bank is a place where people can go to after being referred to obtain food. In the case of the Trussell Trust, they provide a minimum of 3 days nutritionally balanced emergency food and support to people in crisis. The obtaining of food is not unlimited, as clients may be able to redeem up to 3 food bank vouchers in a row. And over 90% of the food that is given out is donated by the public. And I saw this at first hand when I took part in a food collection day prior to Christmas at the Tesco store in Port Glasgow, and I genuinely was overwhelmed by the generosity of the public on that day. Every person who goes to a Trussell Trust food bank is referred by a professional, whether that's a social worker, a welfare rights advisor, tenancy support worker or a school liaison officer. And they try to work with individuals to help them resolve the underlying cause of the crisis. If we look at the scale, of the issue, then we will be shocked. In 2011, there was one Trussell Trust food bank operating in Scotland. By October 2013, this had increased to 43. There are over 400 in operation across the UK. And the Scottish Government report, Food Aid Provision in Scotland, published in December 2013, identified 55 food banks and soup kitchens. However, there are also other independent community small-scale providers which are not reflected in the Trussell Trust figures. And a report published by Church Action and Poverty in Oxfam stated that we estimate that over 500,000 people are now reliant on food aid, the use of food banks and receipt of food parcels. And this number is likely to escalate further over the coming months, and that's a UK figure. There's also the concern that this is reflecting only part of the problem. The organisation Nourish is concerned that the statistics showing increased demand for emergency food provision are just the tip of the iceberg. In fact, Citizens Advice Scotland tell me that in January alone, Scottish CAB advisers had referred over 400 people to a food bank or other emergency support. That's the highest monthly figure that they have ever seen. Oxfam told me that the Western Bartonshire community food share figures have increased markedly also. Last October, they had 186 visits, November was 215, December 237, and January of this year, 358. And the increasing trend is also affecting families. October it was 36, November 64, December 123, and January 145. Of the 1,967 vouchers that have been distributed by the Inverclyde Food Bank, 250 have been to families and 266 to single parents. This is since the Inverclyde Food Bank started in April 2010. In total, the 1,967 vouchers have fed 2,571 adults and 974 children. More recent figures for Scotland estimate somewhere in the region of over 55,000 Scots. 55,000 Scots relying on emergency food aid. Presiding Officer, as Oxfam have stated, no one turns up at a food bank because there is an opportunity for free food. They are driven there in sheer desperation. Oxfam indicates that 34% who turn up to emergency food banks are experiencing some sort of benefit delay. Citizens Advice and the Trussell Trust have that percentage at 30%. Citizens Advice Scotland also state that evidence from Bureau and from food banks themselves indicate that benefit delays and welfare reform are driving increased need for food parcels. And according to the Trussell Trust, since April 2013, welfare reforms have impacted many people and resulted in more referrals to food banks as a result of benefit delays or changes. Presiding Officer, we know that people on benefits usually have the lowest incomes with no savings to cover unforeseen circumstances, and even a slight delay in receiving benefit can mean that they have got no money to buy food for themselves or their children. Now, one of the most alarming pieces of evidence from Oxfam highlights the depths of some people's demise. Some people who use food banks have actually started handing back food items that they need because they can't afford to turn on the electricity to cook the food that they've been given. Now, what does that say about a society where people can't even afford to cook the food that they've been given? But despite all of this evidence, the UK Westminster Government fails to act. And it's not just the coalition government. As we know, that we're now in the middle of a Dutch auction between the Tories and Labour to see who can cut the benefits the most. And as if that isn't bad enough, we heard the news this week that members of the House of Lords are complaining about the declining standards of their subsidised catering facilities, with one peer allegedly being scarred as their table booking was cancelled suddenly and his party were unable to lunch elsewhere because his wife was wearing a tiara. Surely that must prove that the Westminster elite is completely out of touch with the reality of austerity UK. However, there is an opportunity to change all of this. As Monday's Financial Times highlighted, Scotland is a wealthy nation. It's not at the moment, thank you. Scotland is a wealthy nation. Our wealth is squandered by incompetence at Westminster, a parliament and elite that cares more about tiaras than the folk who are in sheer desperation. Presiding Officer, between 2011 and 2013, Scotland experienced faster growth in the number of food banks launching with the Trussell Trust than any other part of the UK. They have helped 48,921 people since the 1st of April last year. And according to Barnardo's, Christmas dinner was a food parcel for a disturbing number of children this year because of the impact of the rising living costs and changes to the welfare system. Presiding Officer, I didn't get involved in politics to mitigate against anyone. I didn't get involved in politics to welcome the increased number of food banks or provide food parcels for Christmas dinner. I got involved to help Scotland and its citizens achieve all that they can be. Thank you.
Before I open up the debate, I need to indicate to the Chamber that there are a great number of members who wish to speak in it, and unless the debate is extended, I won't be able to call them, and even if it is extended, I will have some difficulty calling everyone. I am, however, minded to accept a motion from Stuart-McMillan under Rule 8.14.3 that the debate be extended by up to 30 minutes.
Yes, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. Is that agreed? Parliament is agreed. Speeches of 4 minutes, please. I call Kezia Dugdale to be followed by Jamie Hepburn.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and can congratulate Stuart-McMillan on securing this debate and indeed associate myself with the comments he's made about all the volunteers who make our food banks run week in, week out. I have visited a number of food banks in the Lothians myself, and indeed Cyrenian's fair share, who of course excuse me, are the people who go around all the big supermarkets and get all the cans and goods together in a place and then distribute it around the food banks. I guess if there's any good news that you could possibly look to find in the food bank agenda, it's the fact that some people are being given the opportunity to gain skills and opportunities through working with organisations like Cyrenians, social enterprises like that are facilitating food banks that helps them regain access to the labour market, although there's a substantial amount about food banks that will anger us a great deal. The Citizens Advice Scotland report that feeds the briefing for today mentions payday loans, and it would be remiss of me to recognise the degree to which payday loans are forcing people increasingly to turn to food banks for help. And I very much like the line in Stuart-McMillan's motion where he talked about those that are unemployed, underemployed and underpaid all being reliant on food banks, because I think that gives us a very broad picture of the groups of people who are reliant on food banks at the moment. Whenever I talk about payday loans, I try to make the point that we shouldn't always talk about vulnerable people using payday loans. I think it's wrong to say that people who go to payday loan companies are necessarily vulnerable. The statistics tell us that a large number of them own their own homes, that are in full-time work, that they have families, houses, cars and all the rest of it to run. What they have is too much month left at the end of the money, and that's what forces them to go to payday loan companies. And into food banks for help. Today, though, I want to talk specifically about one very, very vulnerable group of people who are heavily reliant on food banks and find the growing propensity of the use of food banks growingly difficult in their current circumstances. And that in Edinburgh is my experience of people who live in temporary accommodation. There's a huge demand on affordable housing in Edinburgh, a demand that cannot be met. And it's quite possible for people in temporary accommodation in Edinburgh to live in temporary flats or in B&Bs for 3 months, up to 6 months in some cases that I've experienced. The problems with that is that if you live in a hostel or in a B&B, you have no access to kitchen facilities whatsoever. You may, if you are lucky, in some bed and breakfasts in Edinburgh, have access to a kettle. That means if you are going to the food bank to get a food parcel, what you can take from the food bank is massively reduced. And I noticed an article in The Guardian a few weeks ago where Patrick Winter talked about the kind of food bank within a food bank, and that's the notion of a kettle box, where you now had food banks having to prepare bags that do not require any electricity or heat to prepare the food. And the food banks are having to accept that these kettle boxes will not meet nutritional standards, even remotely, and that they're made up of dry crackers and biscuits and tinned sweet corn and tinned potatoes, and that there's no chance that this can meet the nutritional requirement of anybody's daily needs, let alone something that somebody would have to live off of for 6 months. And I wanted to make that emphasis in today's debate, and I had expected to speak further down the speakers' list, where I could be adding on to things that many other people had already said. But I think we have to be careful that we aren't promoting this type of activity by the way that we provide public services through our local authorities. It is Edinburgh City Council, for example, which are providing the full cost per night for every hostel and B&B facility in the city. And I would like to challenge Edinburgh City Council to ask what it gets in return for the £45 per head it pays out, regardless of whether or not that room is filled. And at the moment, they're getting £45 a night to provide no kitchen facilities and the possibility of an access to a kettle for people to feed themselves. So as much as we can share our rage today about the propensity and the reliance that people have to place on food banks now, I think we need to ask some hard questions about what our local authorities are doing and the degree to which we can help them stop things like kettle boxes becoming an ever bigger part of our food bank problem. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. Can I advise members, if they wish to be called early in a members' debate or later in the members' debate, then they can advise the presiding officer of that, and their reasons will be taken into account and accommodated as much as possible. I call Jamie Hepburn to be followed by Claire Baker.
Thank you, President Officer. Can I advise I'm quite happy to be called at this stage. Can I thank Stuart-McMillan for securing today's debate. This is, of course, a very important issue, and as Stuart-McMillan said, I do actually regret the fact that we're having the debate. A society as wealthy as ours should not need food banks, but I think it is important that the Parliament debates this issue, and on that basis I do thank Stuart-McMillan. This is obviously an important issue in the West of Scotland region that Stuart-McMillan represents. It's an issue across Scotland. In my own area, President Officer, we have a food bank in both Cumbernauld and Cocyth, small, independent, local initiatives, and we have other organisations such as the Salvation Army providing resilience for people, and I would like to place on record my thanks to those organisations for their efforts. Indeed, through the Welfare Reform Committee, we know that even in the smallest and most remote communities in Scotland, we're starting to see a tendency for food banks to play an ever more important role in providing assistance to our fellow citizens. And can I say,
Mr Hepburn, I'm sorry to stop you, but I don't know about the rest of the chamber. I'm certainly having some difficulty hearing you.
Okay.
Could you try readjusting your microphone? But if I could also ask broadcasting to check the levels. Thank you. Sorry, Jamie Hepburn.
I'll try shouting louder as well, President Officer. Let's see if that helps. Can I also say the Welfare Reform Committee will be engaging and looking at the role of food banks in due course. President Officer, the Trussell Trust advised us that they launched their first food bank in 2000. I think that's a reminder that this has been an issue. The food banks have been required for a longer period of time than the process of welfare reform itself, but I don't think there can be any doubt that that is a process that has been the major driver for the increased reliance on welfare reform. The Trussell Trust tells us that of the people who have been referred between April 2013 and the beginning of February 2014, the most frequent reasons for food bank referrals to them have been benefit delay at 30% and benefit change at 20%. Oxfam tells most people who turn to emergency food banks are experiencing some sort of benefit delay. Bernardo Scotland also talk about cuts to the levels of welfare support and delays in getting benefits, and the stricter sanction regime as being an important driver in the increased reliance on food banks. And in the Trustworthy Trust, and this was the point made by Stuart-McMillan, that we have seen a large increase in the number of food banks they support in the period 2011 to 2014, a growth from 1 food bank to 43, and that is, of course, the period where welfare reforms have been putting in place. But in the face of this reality, President Officer, I think we do well to remind ourselves that the UK Government actually wrote a letter to Glasgow City Council where they claimed that the driver in the increased number of food banks wasn't their process of welfare reform. Incredibly, they claimed it was because of supermarkets reducing their food waste. So it's supermarket efficiency that is the driver in the increased number of food banks, not their welfare reform process. These are UK Government ministers, President Officer, that are frankly divorced from reality. And if I can say, I regret very much that there are no members of the UK Government parties in the Chamber to perhaps defend that position. It would be interesting to hear if they concur that it's supermarket efficiency rather than the process of welfare reform that's driven the increased use of food banks. I do think, though, supermarkets do have a role to play, and can I refer to one example from my own constituency? Kilsyth Community Food Bank has just recently entered into partnership with the local branch of Lidl, and Lidl will now be providing them with food that they can no longer sell but that's still edible, and that will be supplied to the food bank. That's a sensible approach, and I think both organisations should be congratulated, because frankly, in this day and age, any day and age, it's criminal if we see supermarkets disposing of edible food, sending it to landfill, putting it in the bin. I simply think it's a greater crime in my mind than a person so desperate to feed themselves that they may retrieve such foodstuff that's been binned, if I can say that, Presiding Officer. These supermarkets should be supporting food banks. So can I close by thanking Stuart-McMillan once more. I hope if we ever debate this in future, we'll be debating food banks as a historical aberration rather than an ongoing reality.
Thank you. Can I ask members again if they could try to keep to 4 minutes? I did allow Mr Hepburn a bit extra for the interruption. Claire Baker, to be followed by Nigel Dawn.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First, I'd like to thank Stuart-McMillan for bringing this issue to the Chamber, though I do regret some of the tone of his comments. I don't imagine he does, but I do. I recently went to Hollywood Magazine's food conference, and although not on the programme, the debate shifted to the extreme contrast we see in Scotland around food. We often have debates in here on Scotland's food and drink sector and celebrate how good our export figures are or how excellent our produce is, but we also have people living in poverty, in food poverty in Scotland, and we must address these extremes. And we are seeing increases in food poverty across the UK. The Trussell Trust briefing shows that the number of people they have supported has grown dramatically. Undoubtedly, benefit changes have pushed families and individuals into situations where they can no longer feed themselves or their household. The cuts to benefits for many people have been punitive. Often the need for emergency food as a result of a delay in the benefits payments, the difficulty and delays involved in transitioning between different payments. And even if there are members of the Chamber who support the welfare changes, they cannot be supportive of a welfare system that is dysfunctional and is failing in its administration. If you are living comfortably, a few days' delay in your income can make little difference. But if you are poor and living on the margins of society, these delays can have a big impact. The CAS briefing shows that over 2/3 of clients needing a food parcel were experiencing issues with the benefit system. However, if we see that as the only reason, we can't fully address the problems. Redundancy, low-wage economy, zero-hours contracts, mental health problems, crisis situations, these are all examples that are given by people working in the field of the pressures that people are facing. So key to addressing this issue is around income. Wages and benefits haven't kept pace with the cost of living. The cost of living has gone up, and that has included food prices. The Bernardo's briefing for today says that between 2007 and 2012, food prices rose between 19% and 47%. And these figures, I think, also really contribute to a debate on how we make our food affordable while still providing a fair income to the producer. And last week in this chamber, we had a debate on CAP, and while many of our farmers receive public money to produce their excellent produce and provide multiple benefits to the environment and rural economies, we can't get away from the fact that in Scotland there are people who can't afford to buy that produce. That may be difficult for some people to imagine, that the cost of a family meal is beyond their budget. But for some people, as Kes Dugdale described, the situation is so desperate they either have no cooking facilities or they have no money to pay their energy bills, so food banks are now having to create kettle packs. In my own region, we've seen the growth of food banks, with 6 now open in Fife. I visited Trussell Trust in Dundee and spoke to Ewan Gurr about their organisation. And I recently went to the launch of Kirkcaldy Food Bank, and I'd like to recognise the hard work of the churches and the faith groups across Kirkcaldy who came together to create that food bank. The support from the community and local businesses has been very strong. But the demand does put pressure on communities, and yesterday in the local papers we had reports of Glenrothes Food Bank running out of food and being unable to support people. We also have food banks in Leven, Dunfermline, Cooper and Strother, all across the kingdom, from communities that we identify as poor to communities we identify as affluent. So from visiting food banks and talking to volunteers, I can see that that's a real community response to the increasing poverty they are seeing around them. And it is a charitable act. But I also see that they are not accepting this as the way that it has to be. Ian Duncan-Smith's recent comments on food banks were deeply regrettable, and I think they look to deny the reality of food banks. If we accept the reality, then we can deal with the issues that are causing the need for them. We should support food banks, but our aim, through measures such as a living wage, a functioning fair welfare system and better paying conditions at work, must be that we can see the end of them.
Many thanks. I call Nigel Dawn to be followed by Jackie Bailey. And if members keep to 4 minutes, we should get everyone in. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I thank Stuart-McMillan for bringing this. Though, like everybody else, regret that we're even having to talk about it, this really is not where we should be in 2014 in Scotland. I don't want to rehearse any of the figures that other people have already indicated, because I think there's no need to do that on the record. But I do want to note that if 2/3 of those who report to food banks are citing benefit issues as being their main concern, then it is clearly important that the UK government understands that and looks at the systems. Systems really should work. We should not be not giving enough people enough money. But the other point that I noted was that less than 5% of those who are food bank clients are actually homeless. So what we have is a structural problem with those who actually do have a roof over their head, may well be working, but simply are still living in poverty. And that's not, I suspect, where historically we've thought we had to help our communities. We've tended to believe that it was kind of the downs and outs and they really were a problem. These are ordinary people who just don't have enough money. And that's a slightly different case from what we might have thought in the past. Folk have already mentioned the fact that food price increases have actually been disproportionate recently, and I'm grateful to Kezia Dugdale for her comments about the nutritional effect of not even being able to cook that, when of course the effect would actually be that you can't even heat it either, and the absence of heating cannot possibly do any good to the human. I noticed the Scottish Government report, which looked at all this very recently, and I think reported within the last 2 or 3 months, noted that the Trussell Trust statistics were probably quite representative of what was happening in Scotland. I think that's actually helpful. I'm looking at the Minister as I say this, because it does look as though the data is being collected and we will have a sensible handle on what's going on, even if we'd rather not have this problem at all. I have visited Angus Food Bank, particularly in Brechin, where I stay, and I do want to pay tribute to those who do the work there, to those who volunteer, to those who train the volunteers, to those who manage that across the country. That's enormously important. I'd also like to note that this is a problem which isn't going to go away. However, we want to blame the UK government for this, and I think a lot of it does land at their door. Some of it, I guess, is just a consequence of the international downturn which we have seen, but it depends how you respond to that. This is not an issue that's going to go away anytime soon. We will continue to need volunteers within our communities, and we will continue to need donations. I think Jamie Hepburn commented that supermarkets are able to play a part in that. But our communities in general, we as members of our local community, are going to have to donate food and encourage others to do that. Because in Scotland at the moment, we are going to have to look after our own. I hesitate to point it out, but I do like to think that if we actually had the powers in an independent country, we would be able to deal with some of this. But for the moment, we're going to have to do it with the resources we have. And that, Presiding Officer, includes you and me. Thank you. Thank you. Now call Jackie Bailey to be followed by Neil Findlay.
Presiding Officer, let me start by joining others in congratulating Stuart-McMillan for securing this debate, but I too wish to express my disappointment with part of his contribution that struck me as having more to do with an argument about the Constitution than the reality that people are living with now. Because we are facing a cost of living crisis, the likes of which has not been seen since the 1930s. Incomes are stagnating at best and falling behind at worst. And let me illustrate this, because since 2010, wages in Scotland have fallen in real terms by £27.30 a week. That's £1,420 a year, which is a lot of money for somebody who is low paid. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation report, a minimum income standard for the UK in 2013, highlighted that the cost of a basket of essential goods and services had increased by nearly 25% in the last 5 years. Now that's staggering. The cost of bread is up, the cost of milk is up, the cost of electricity and gas are up too. And over the last 3 years since the Tories came to office, prices have risen faster in the UK than in any other G7 country. So times are tough. They are increasingly tough for people who are employed as well as those who are unemployed. And I'm particularly pleased that the work of Western Bartonshire Food Share has been highlighted. That project is in my constituency. I have been out on a number of occasions helping them collect food and donations in the communities that we serve. And I want to pay particular tribute, not just to the Management Committee, but to all the hard-working volunteers that support their work. They have recently been awarded £50,000 by the big lottery to help, and I am extremely grateful that that has happened, because they are finding that demand is increasing. Now, I won't repeat the figures that Stuart-McMillan shared with you. Suffice to say that they've had an increase of 100% in their numbers just in the last 4 months, and for families over the same period, a staggering increase of 400%. The Trussell Trust reported in April this year that the number of people in Scotland using food banks has risen by 150%, from 5,726 to a staggering 14,318. It will, of course, be more. 1/3 of these were children. 1/5 were in full-time employment. The latest research from Debt Advisory Scotland shows that 1 in 10 Scots borrowed money to pay for food in July last year. It will be worse. But 1 in 10 is 500,000 people. We can only begin to imagine what it's like now. And whilst we're very grateful for the work of all these volunteers in communities across Scotland, what a damning indictment on our society that food banks even exist. And it appears from anecdotal evidence from Citizens Advice Scotland that some local authorities have been sending people to food banks rather than providing a crisis grant. And of course, Presiding Officer, all of this happening whilst the Scottish Welfare Fund remains hugely underspent. For the last figures published, only 11% of the £33 million available has gone out the door, and this at a time when the need is self-evident. Those benefits have been devolved. It is in our hands already, yet we can't get the money out of the door. And frankly, I think the Minister would agree that is appalling, and it would be helpful to know what action is being taken. We asked the Scottish Government to commission research, and I'm pleased that that's now been published. But what will the Scottish Government do? Of course, we should challenge the Tories and the Lib Dems at Westminster. It is not enough, though, to simply wash your hands and blame Westminster. We created this Parliament to protect people when times are tough. Let's not turn this into yet another issue seen through a constitutional prism, but take action to protect people who are suffering in communities across Scotland now.
Thank you. I call Neil Findlay to be followed by Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. I think for anyone with an interest in social and economic justice and fairness, this debate of all debates must get the political juices and emotions flowing. But equally, I'm embarrassed and I'm ashamed and angry at having to take part in this debate. In a wealthy, developed nation, people in my home village, my county, my country, throughout the nations of the UK and way beyond, cannot feed their children, their family or indeed themselves. Over 50,000 of you and my fellow Scots seeking help in the last year alone. If we look at a full Ibrox or Celtic Park on a Saturday, it's the equivalent of every man, women and child in that stadium going hungry. A huge and growing scandal. And those who present to food banks are decent people, often hard-working people, keeping down a job or indeed several jobs, trying to survive, yet forced to wipe away their tears, swallow their pride and walk through the doors of a food bank to ask for help to feed their children. Presiding Officer, I've been unemployed, but I'm very fortunate that it was for a short-lived period, and I have never, ever ended up going hungry, and neither have any members in my family. I cannot, indeed, I don't think any of us here can imagine what it's like to be in that position, looking into the cupboard or the fridge and seeing little or nothing there. I cannot imagine the mental turmoil, the pressure, the feelings and thoughts that people experience in the days and weeks leading up to the time when they're forced into a situation where the food bank is their only option. We can only wonder how that feels. Even the thought of it, as I speak, makes my stomach churn. God knows what it's like to those in that real-life situation. But, Presiding Officer, we have to be honest. The growth in the use of food banks hasn't occurred by chance. It hasn't occurred because of an individual's behaviour. It hasn't happened because of somebody's bad luck. It's happened because of deliberate political choices and a decades-long adherence to the doctrine of neoliberalism. This is an ideology that promotes the rule of the market, the free movement of capital and goods, deregulation, trickle-down economics, an attack on organised labour, freedom from the state, and it celebrates reducing public expenditure for social services such as health and education, promotes privatisation and promotes individualism over a collective approach to our economy and society. It's a doctrine that's dominated political thinking over the last 40 years, a doctrine that's resulted in mass redistribution of resources from poor people to rich people, repeated attacks on trade unions, went forward with market deregulation, saw our public services privatised, even in some countries the water that people drink privatised, resulted in poverty and food shortages across the developing world, and now coming to us in the developed world, whilst at the same time we have the biggest corporations rewarded with yet more tax cuts and profits, and all the time benefits, services and social protection reduced. Food banks, homelessness, low pay, insecure work are the symptoms of such a system. Now, Stuart-McMillan referred to Westminster as the problem. Now, I'm as happy as anyone to put the boot into the Tories and the Liberals. But we have food banks in France, we have food banks in Spain, we have food banks across the EU. Tory cuts exacerbate the problem, but they're not the root cause of the problem. That is much, much deeper. Of course, though, it is very telling that not a single Tory or pathetic Liberal could turn up to take the consequences. They're usually here every day for members' debates, yet there's not one of them here today. So I would like to see us, Presiding Officer, in a world where we see feeding people as our priority over profit, and where we use new technology and human ingenuity to manage the scourge of hunger for everyone.
Thank you. Gordon MacDonald, to be followed by Cara Hilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I also thank Stuart-McMillan for securing this debate. The UK, in terms of total GDP, is the 7th wealthiest nation, yet it is the 6th most unequal of the OECD countries. A study by the Trussell Trust states that over 50% of children living in poverty in the UK are from working households, and many of the people helped by food banks are in work. The latest figures from that study highlights that in the 6 months to September 2013, 350,000 people received 3 days emergency food from one of their food banks. This is 8 times the 41,000 who needed support in the year to March 2010, which in turn was substantially up from the 3,000 who required support from the Trust in 2005-06. Here in Scotland, it's estimated that nearly 49,000 people have received assistance from a food bank in the 10 months to January of this year. In my constituency, there are food banks in Broomhouse, Oxgangs, Saughton Mains, Sighthill and Wester Hales. So why is it that in such a rich country so many people require support from food banks? Well, a survey carried out by the Trussell Trust last year found that 34% needed help as a result of benefit delay, 19% due to benefit changes, and another 18% as a result of low income. Only 4% were referred to the food bank because they were homeless. Citizens' Advice found that delays in payments, job seeker sanctions, sickness benefit reassessments and the bedroom tax are placing a significant burden on many low-income families and making it difficult for them to put food on the table. And an Oxfam study found that some of the increase was due to unemployment, increasing levels of underemployment, low and falling income and rising food and fuel prices. The difficulty of falling income is further compounded when you factor in that food prices have risen by nearly 13% above inflation over the last 6 years, and the cost of gas and electricity has increased by 37% since October 2010. At present, the welfare system and the setting of the national minimum wage are all reserved matters to Westminster. The UK Government has witnessed these rises and yet has done very little to ensure that benefit levels and the minimum wage have kept pace with inflation. The Oxfam report, Walking the Breadline, the scandal of food poverty in 21st century Britain, highlights growing concern. The UN's Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food recently pointed to the increases in the number of food banks in developing countries as an indicator that governments are in danger of failing in their duty to protect under the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which states that all citizens should have access to adequate diet without having to compromise other basic needs. The Scottish Government has tried to mitigate the welfare cuts by the establishment of a Scottish Welfare Fund, and the budget passed yesterday will increase the money available through discretionary housing payments to the limit imposed by the DWP of close to £23 million. And I welcome the announcement by John Swinney yesterday that if the DWP refuse the request to lift the cap on discretionary housing payments, the Government will make a further £12 million available to social landlords to prevent evictions solely due to the bedroom tax.
Conclude, please.
But instead of trying to compensate for Westminster benefit cuts, surely it would be better if we could tackle the problems of poverty head-on in Scotland by controlling the benefit system here in Holyrood. Scotland in the 21st century is a wealthy country, but Westminster is taking us back to Victorian levels of poverty. We need to build a society we can all be proud of, and the opportunity to begin that starts in September.
Thank you. Cara Hilton, to be followed by Ken McIntosh.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The very existence of food banks in Scotland is truly saddening. It's something that shames and embarrasses us all. But worse than their existence is the fact that the need for them is growing day by day, week for week. And I was shocked to read in the CAB briefing that from April to September last year, almost 6 times as many Scots turned to food parcels compared to the same period the year before. Ironically, as others have highlighted, food banks do also showcase what is good about our society, though. Those who volunteer, offering their time and energy to ensure the success of their local food bank, display amazing civic duty, all that's inspiring and best in people. But this is 2014, as Neil Finlay's pointed out. It's not 1914. We're one of the richest countries in the world. And when we hear about mums and dads that are walking miles each way to pick up food to put on the table for their children, when we hear about senior doctors and academics concerned that hunger in Britain has reached the level of a public health emergency, when teachers tell us that children are turning up at our schools hungry, then that makes me extremely angry, and I know that colleagues across the chamber feel the same, well, except for the no-show Tories and Lib Dems. There's absolutely no doubt that the austerity measures, the taxation policies, the welfare reforms implemented by the coalition government have been key factors in the rise of food banks. We've seen tax cuts for the richest millionaires, while hard-pressed families see their tax credits cut and their child benefit frozen. A bedroom tax that hits the poor and the disabled hardest, while the government turns a blind eye to tax evasion by multinational companies. reforms to benefits that see people sanctioned and left penniless. I visited Dunfermline Food Bank recently, and they told me that when the bedroom tax came in last April, the number seeking food parcels went up by 180% that week alone. They tell me that clients are increasingly turning to them as a result of benefit sanctions. People increasingly desperate, but nowhere else to turn, yet the food bank can only help them for a few days. What happens to someone that's been sanctioned for months? How are they supposed to put food on the table? Never mind, pay their electricity bills, put shoes on their children, pay their bus fare to work or to seek work. And the only choice that some people have got left is to steal or to starve. Before Christmas, there's a constituent came to see me at my surgery. He'd already had Easter food parcels. He had 2 packets of frozen burgers to last the week. And what type of society are we living in when we allow this to happen? In 21st century Scotland, and indeed across the UK, no child should be going to school with an empty belly. No mum should be choosing between heating and eating. No family should be left destitute because of a welfare system that penalises people rather than supporting them. Of the 2,147 cases dealt with by Dunfermline Food Bank since last April, 1,255 were as a direct result of benefit changes or delays. A further 205 were due to low pay. People just simply don't have the money to last the month. John Driley, who does an excellent job in running the Dunfermline Food Bank, tells me that the bedroom tax is at least a contributory factor in almost all cases, and it's the sole factor in many. Yesterday, we secured agreement on mitigating the bedroom tax in Scotland, and I hope this will make a real difference to families in Dunfermline and across Scotland who are struggling to make ends meet. But just as it was time yesterday for Holyrood to use the powers we have to change people's life, now is the time for the UK Government to wake up and face up to the cost of living crisis that it's created. It's time to end the scandal where families in our country are going hungry. Their denial has gone on long enough. It's time for action.
Thank you very much. I must keep members tight. I'm afraid I will not be able to call everyone. Ken McIntosh to be followed by James Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and may I begin by also thanking Stuart-McMillan for bringing forward today's debate and allowing us to debate food banks. As he highlighted in his opening remarks and in his motion, the phenomenal rise, the rapid growth of food banks across our country is simultaneously one of the most welcome and yet one of the most disturbing developments in our society. And the passion with which so many members, and Cara Hilton being an excellent example, have spoken, shows how much this subject has touched us all. As a demonstration of our capacity for charity, selflessness and generosity, food banks are entirely admirable. The work of the volunteers who run them, the members of the public who donate to them, the churches and other voluntary groups who sponsor and organise them stand out as a beacon of compassion at a time when it feels like the bile of and lack of sympathy of spiteful austerity is the order of the day. But when you speak to those volunteers in the East Renfrewshire Food Bank in my own constituency, or at Nether Althouse and James Dornan's constituency, which I visited last week, the message is the same. Yes, we are pleased to provide the service, but we hope not to be here for too long, because we hope there will be no need for food banks. Presiding Officer, as members now know, the Parliament's Welfare Reform Committee is shortly to conduct an exercise, an evidence session on food banks, and I hope we'll be able to shed some light, not just on why they've sprung up in such numbers, but what our response as a Parliament should be. We're used to the concept of relative poverty in this country, but the return of food poverty in a wealthy economy and society is deeply troubling. What on earth has happened to our welfare state if we cannot ensure that everyone gets a square meal? Now, we certainly don't have all the answers to shape our response, but we can make a number of observations. And I have to say, I found myself entirely in agreement with Claire Baker, who accurately listed a number of factors, centering on income, I think, low income in particular, as one of the main concerns. I also agreed entirely with Nigel Dawn's comments that food banks are not for the down and out, or very few of them are for the down and out and the homeless. And I think it was the Trussell Trust which said that less than 5% using food banks are homeless. These are often working people with dependents. Two of the women I met last week, in fact, drove there in their own car. All, however, were struggling to get by, and most had suffered from welfare reforms one way or another. Those I spoke to had all heard of the food bank through word of mouth, all had been then given a referral strip by the job centre. The staff or volunteers at the food banks go out of their way not to be judgmental or to preach, but there is a relationship for all to navigate of awkwardness, potential for stigma or shame. And in our own parliamentary inquiry, I think it will be very important, essential in fact, to have a clear sense, to establish a clear sense of the emotions felt by those using food banks to help us understand and learn from the experience. And again, anecdotally, without wishing to digress, the use of benefit sanctions is clearly a huge factor. One constituency raised with me the prospect that benefit staff are actually being encouraged to meet targets for increasing sanctions. And that strikes me as an even more pressing issue than the bedroom tax in driving people towards relying on food banks. So clear questions for our UK government if DWP are referring people to food banks but also imposing sanctions. But clear questions too for the Scottish Government, and Jackie Bailey highlighted this. What's the role of the Scottish Welfare Fund? Oxfam highlighted that their experience in food shortage situations around the world tells us that giving out cash, not emergency food parcels, is more effective and more dignified. So we're all feeling this. The cost of living crisis is hitting us. But as Neil Findlay very powerfully pointed out, it's too simple to point to benefit cuts as the only reason. I celebrate the benevolence and commitment of others, but there are questions here too for our governments to respond with similar compassion. Thank you.
Many thanks. James Dornan, to be followed by Patricia Ferguson.
Thank you very much, Convener. I'd also like to start by thanking Stuart-McMillan for bringing this debate to the Chamber. This is one, and also the Trust for all the good work they've done, both in the food banks and round about this debate. This is one of these debates that's probably the most schizophrenic that a politician feels, because both my local MP, Tom Harris, and I were at the launch of the Nether Aldhouse one. And it was along with the local councillors, and it was one of these events where you feel systematically proud and ashamed at the same time. You feel proud of the work that the church had done, and the local volunteers are doing, the goodwill from local supermarkets like the local Morrisons and Newlands and others, and the people who are donating food. But you feel shame that in 2013, I think it was then, 2013, that you need this. In 2012, I visited the South East one in Butterbiggins Road, and I've got some statistics here. In the year 2012 to 2013, they fed 682 people, but already in the first 3 months of 2013-14 for them in their calendar, they fed 1,200. There's a huge impact both locally and nationally. I mean, the figures nationally are staggering. I mean, some of them have been talked about earlier on, but in 2005-06, there was approximately 3,000 people in food banks in the UK. There's now 350,000. That would just terrify you. I want to talk a wee bit about the Nether Aldhouse. As I say, we were at the launch of that, and since then, I've been in a fortunate position. Every December, we try and make it, usually it's a kind of the month for kids, so we try and get people to donate toys, and we dish them out to charity from my office. This year, because of this, because of the situation, we decided what we'd do is we'd share that and ask people to donate both toys and food, and then pass that stuff on to the local food bank. Again, overwhelmed by the generosity of constituents, overwhelmed by the generosity of the community, we managed to fill a few cars full and get them up to the food bank, where they were gratefully received and well used. While I was up there talking to them, they were telling me that just that morning they had fed a family of 8 with the stuff from the food bank. And as has already been mentioned a number of times, these are not people who have not worked for 10 years. These are not people who are struggling to find a place to stay. These are people who have got an established life, and many of them will be working, many of them have families to bring up and have brought them up. And then circumstances change, and circumstances dictate that you go from having that reasonably stable life to not being able to feed your kids. How bad can that be? Like Neil Findlay, I have been unemployed, and unfortunately for a while I was pretty poor. And I did know, and I had a young family at the time, and I did know how difficult it was. But I was never in those situations, because you have a support network round about you. To not have that, to be in a situation where you have to forgo your pride, really, to make sure that your family is fed, is something that you just, does not bear thinking about. We as politicians have a huge task ahead of us to try and make sure that we mitigate that. I'm not going to play party politics here. I think this is far too serious an issue for doing that. The only thing I would say is the Scottish Welfare Fund, it's the councils that are responsible for it. It's the councils that are responsible for making sure that that money is used properly. And I think we should be very wary of trying to score points here, because I'm not even going to mention my own council on this. I was very impressed with Cara Hilton's contribution. I thought that was good, along with Neil Findlay's and others. The point that Kezia raised about Kezia Dugdale about the councils paying no matter what they get for it is a very good point, and it's something I'll be taking away and looking at my own local authority to see if there's any scope there for making sure, if that does happen, that it's looked at and changed. You must conclude, please. Okay. Other than that, once again, I'd like to thank Stuart-McMillan. I'd like to thank the Trussell Trust for all the good work they've done. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Patricia Ferguson, and a short contribution from James Kelly afterwards.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I add my congratulations to Stuart-McMillan for securing this debate. I joined the Labour Party at the time of the miners' strike in the 1980s, and I vividly recall collecting foodstuffs to help support striking miners and their families at that difficult time. So to find myself 30 years later standing at a supermarket collecting food to be distributed to needy constituents, quite frankly, appalls me. So, Presiding Officer, what does that time and this have in common? Well, it's quite simple. The Conservatives are in charge. The Conservatives, a party that knows the price of everything and the value of nothing, and a party that seems to be insulated from the reality of the lives lived by so many of our constituents. It's surely no coincidence that the number of people relying on food banks has risen as welfare reforms bite, food and fuel prices increase and wages are pegged. Unexpected delays in processing benefits don't help either. And we're seeing single people, pensioners, families, those who have recently come to our country and who are particularly vulnerable, those without work and those with work, having to look to someone else to help to feed them and their families. Across the country, food banks have to support more and more people every week. Even the radio programme The Archers had a recent storyline where one of the families featured had to use a food bank to get by. But that was fiction, and not the grim reality that faces so many across the UK and beyond. And local police have indicated that the demographic of shoplifters has also changed significantly in the last few years, with more and more of those who are apprehended being identified as having stolen because they just can't afford to buy food. So if the need for food banks appalls me, and it does, the commitment and dedication of those who volunteer and organise food banks inspires in equal measure. In my own constituency, the Greater Maryhill Food Bank is the largest and best known. Starting with a few people associated with Maryhill Parish Church, it has grown, and in less than 9 months now has some 21 partner organisations and several outlets covering more than half of my constituency. It has organised Christmas lunches and Christmas presents for children, and it depends entirely on donations and volunteers, like so many others we've heard about today. It also has, and I'm pleased to say this, significant help from our local supermarkets, which is very welcome. Now, I know that the volunteers who staff our food bank do it because they see need around them and because they want to help their neighbours. They don't do it for praise or for recognition. But I do want to single out a few people, and through them, all the others who help out in this way. Firstly has to be the inimitable Deacon Jim Hamilton. If Jim didn't already exist, we would have to invent him. So ubiquitous is he in the life of Maryhill. And Sheila Ramsey, the parish worker, who with Jim sparked the idea in the first place. And I would also mention Julie Hislop, whose enthusiasm for her community knows no bounds, but who has found herself working on an almost full-time basis for the project. Now, Presiding Officer, I mentioned that the Conservatives are responsible for much of the problem, and they are. But there are measures that we have in place and that we can pursue. And I hope in closing the Minister might be able to say what other measures can be taken to ensure that the money that is there for the Welfare Fund can stop being in council coffers and be pushed out to those who need it best. But, Presiding Officer, I wait and work for the day when everyone at the Greater Maryhill Food Bank is redundant, because no one in our communities needs the service that they so faithfully provide. And let's hope that that day comes soon.
Thank you very much. And finally, James Kelly, around 3.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Like Patricia Ferguson, I want to recall the miners' strike from 30 years ago. In my experience, working with other colleagues in Cambuslang and organising food collections in that miners' strike, and it is an absolute scandal that 30 years on from that, we now see evidence of food banks all over Scotland. As the Trust says in its contribution, 23,000 food parcels issued between April and September last year. You know, that is shameful in a modern community, in a modern society. I think in assessing the reasons for the growth in food banks, it's quite clear that there is a cost of living crisis. We are seeing food prices increasing. We're seeing incomes decrease as people's wages don't match the increases in food prices, and also fuel prices rocketing. And with each 5% increase in fuel prices, 46,000 people are added to the fuel poverty roll. I think one of the primary reasons for this is the policies being pursued by the Conservative Lib Dem coalition at Westminster. And I regret the tone of Stuart-McMillan's comments in trying to lump the Labour Party in with the policies being pursued by those in the coalition. Like others, I want to pay tribute to those who operate the food bank in my local area in Rutherglen and Cambuslang, particularly Brendan Rooney and Therese Reid. I attended a church service in Rutherglen last night to highlight the work that is carried out by the 60 volunteers. And one of the examples given was that a young man recently presented himself at the food bank, and he didn't even have a plate or a cup. Never mind a microwave or a cooker to cook the food. And that shows some of the really difficult cases that those food banks are having to deal with. And there's a lot of really excellent work going on by those in Rutherglen and Cambuslang to service that food bank. I do regret the existence of food banks throughout Scotland, and we have to look at what can be done to move the situation forward. It's absolutely clear that there needs to be an alternative policies pursued at a Westminster level that puts people and communities first. I also think that the administration of the Scottish Welfare Fund has to be looked at. The fund, of course, is absolutely welcome, but I think everyone in the Chamber would agree that where we've got a fund like that in place, we've got to ensure that the funds get down to those who need it. And I'll be interested to hear the Minister explain what more the Government can do to ensure that the funds get down to the needy communities and individuals. So in summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, I think it is regrettable that we do have the existence of so many food banks in the country, and we need to all speak out loudly and clearly for an alternative approach which moves us away from the existence for these very food banks.
Many thanks. And to now invite the Minister to respond to the debate. The Minister is Margaret Burgess, and you have 7 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you, Presiding Officer. And like others, I would also congratulate Stuart-McMillan for securing this debate, which is something that's clearly we feel very passionate about, that our citizens are having to turn to food banks to eat. And it is absolutely unacceptable, and I think everyone who's spoken in the debate, that anyone in a country as prosperous as Scotland should have to rely on food banks, and that so many of our citizens are living on inadequate incomes. And of course that concerns us all. And that concern is evident in the efforts made by the providers of the food banks, the volunteers who distribute the food and who work in the centres, and all the people and organisations that donate to ensure that some of our most vulnerable people get food on the table. And it's been mentioned by numbers, Scotland is a wealthy country. Yet last week, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation published a report that found living standards fell between 2008 and 9 and 2011 and 12, increasing the proportion living below the minimum income standard to 21%. And the report said, and I quote, in 2011-12, the proportion of families below the standard rose sharply as benefit and tax credit cuts started to kick in. And this is a clear indication of the damaging impact of the welfare cuts coming from Westminster, which are estimated to reduce benefits in Scotland by over £4.5 billion in the 5 years to 2015. And where's this money coming from? It's taken from the very people we've been talking about in this debate, from workers and low income, from families, from those with long-term illness or disability, from tenants in receipt of housing benefit, and from people in the most vulnerable circumstances. And in my view, that's precisely the people that society should be helping and not harming. And it tells me that what we have is a failed welfare state in the UK. And
Jackie Bailey.
I couldn't agree with her more, but I'm wondering, given that the case has been made by some of your backbenchers for the case for independence, which of these cuts would you be reversing?
Minister.
I will move on. We've already said a number of things within the white paper, which I'll touch on later, how we would proceed in an independent Scotland. But one thing's clear from me. We would have a system and a welfare system that looks after those that need it most, a system that we've all got a stake in, that a system we know what to expect from when we need it, and I might talk a bit more about that later. But I'm sure that we're all aware of our constituents that are turning to food banks when they struggle to make ends meet. And what we should try and do is understand the issues and help as much as we can. And that's why the Scottish Government commissioned research on the nature of food aid provision in Scotland, which Nigel Dawn referred to earlier and which was published in December. And we now understand more about the extent of emergency food aid in Scotland and that welfare and benefit changes are a major cause of the substantial increase in the use of food banks. And I met, as you've probably heard before, with Lord Freud last week. And while at that meeting, I took the opportunity to give him a copy of our research and to inform him of some of the damaging impacts of the Government's welfare reform programme is having in our citizens in Scotland. But meanwhile, the UK Government's research on food banks remains unpublished by DEFRA, and perhaps that's why we've got no UK Government representatives or parties from the UK Government in the Chamber today. Clearly, they obviously are not so concerned about food banks as others. But we've heard a lot also about costs of living and the low incomes that we have here in Scotland, that many people have. But part of the contract between the people of Scotland and this Scottish Government is defending and extending certain core universal services, rights and benefits through the social wage. And that includes increasing the provision of free nursery education, freezing council tax, paying the living wage to all staff covered by the public sector pay policy, and encouraging other employers to follow our lead. And from January, we will extend entitlement to free school meals for all children in primaries 1 to 3, worth around £330 a year per child. That takes a meal up for families throughout the country. We've also made efforts to mitigate some of the UK welfare reform proposals. I have a time for an intervention, Presiding Officer.
Neil Findlay.
I wonder if I could ask the Minister, I'm reluctant to get into party politics in this, but I wonder if I could ask her, with cuts to council services, who is it that's most affected? Is it people on the lowest income or is it people on the highest income?
Minister.
As I said earlier in my statement, we have a contract with all the people of Scotland to ensure that we make sure that those freezing the council tax is helping families, we're not leaving people out, paying the living wage, free prescriptions, and that is the contract we have with the citizens of this country. We've also made efforts to mitigate some of the worst impacts of welfare reform policies. £40 million to protect people from the 10% cuts in council tax, £7 million for welfare mitigation, £9.2 million into the Scottish Welfare Fund. Now, there's been a lot of questions raised about the Scottish Welfare Fund, and I absolutely agree with members. The Scottish Welfare Fund was set up and created to ensure that that money got out to the people that needed it most. It is a new fund. We know that. Councils had never had to operate this before. And early in the fund, as was mentioned, the take-up wasn't as we anticipated, but I announced in the Chamber last week in answer to a question that our informal feedback from the local authorities now, that since we introduced easier access to the fund, change some of the criteria. What we're seeing now is that the take-up is rising much higher, and to the informal stats to December, and that's been shared with the Welfare Reform Committee, is showing that the fund will be taken up and is now being used the way it should be. People are not directed from the Welfare Fund to food banks if they would qualify for the Welfare Fund. It is only if they do not meet the criteria that a local authority will send them to the Welfare Fund. And if anyone has any examples of that, something different happening, then we need to get those examples here. But as has been said, that's about mitigation. We are mitigating the impacts of UK government policies in Scotland, and mitigation, in my view, is not enough. In Scotland's future, our white paper on independence, we set out why we believe there is a better way for social security in Scotland. And I appreciate that we all share the same views on food banks and how we feel, but I feel quite strongly the way forward for Scotland is to be an independent country, to ensure that we have a social security system that we all have a stake in. We contribute to it when we can, and in return we should be able to access the system when we need to. The system needs to be fair, transparent and sympathetic to the challenges faced by people, respecting personal dignity, equality and human rights. For those who can't undertake paid work, benefits should not relegate them to a life of financial uncertainty and poverty. Welfare support needs to support a standard of living that ensures dignity and enables participation in society. And I believe passionately independence would allow the Scottish Parliament to make decisions on welfare, reverse the most damaging of the Westminster changes, ensure that we have a system that better meets Scotland's circumstances, allow us to build a fairer and more prosperous country where, as everybody in this chamber agrees, we don't want to see food banks. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Before I suspend Parliament, can I put on the record that members who participate in members' debates should not leave the debates before the closing speeches unless they have a pressing reason which has been notified to the presiding officer, because to do so is discourteous to Parliament. That concludes Stuart-McMillan's debate, and I now suspend this meeting until 2:30 p.m.